back in World War II, really through almost all of it, but particularly in the early phases of it, navigation from A to B had never really been well developed. It was, again, an art whose time was yet to come. It's not an easy thing to do to go from A to B when things are not going well. Things don't look the same. And we go back to the stories of the airmail pilots in the early days in the 30s, and that certainly, they lost a lot of airplanes doing that. Systems had to be developed that would allow airplanes to fly at night in bad weather and not only get off the ground, but to get there and then get back down to the ground safely. It was an absolute necessity. We had, in the beginning phases, 3 types of navigation. Pilotage, which is looking at a map and saying there's Walmart down there, so I'm okay, because that's where it's supposed to be, and going from here to there. You had dead reckoning, which is the most common thing we did, which was drawing a line on a map from A to B, measuring it, putting in all of the stuff you needed to know there, figuring in your winds, and then calculating the heading you were going to have to fly and the time it was going to take you to get there and how much fuel you were going to have when you arrived. That was used throughout World War II mostly by fighters entirely. Well, in the late 30s, the CAA, which is now the FAA, became aware that something had to be done to make navigation safer, more dependable. And I'm going to come back to this one that I had on here and talk about in a minute. One of the first things that they developed was for night flying. Originally, people thought that the airplane was just a real neat toy, but you could never fly it at night or in weather or anything like that. Well, that was probably true in those days. So CAA came up with this kind of a thing right here, which was called the light line. And it was a series of beacons at roughly 25-mile intervals. And those rotating beacons were color-coded. On one side, they were the regular white beacon. On the other side, they would be either red or green. And then in between would be a Morse code. One of the reasons we had to learn Morse code, there was a 2-digit identifier for that station. From the air, you didn't see those beams. All you saw was the flashes of light. If it was a green light on the backside, then there were night landing facilities there, which meant that they had lights and they were turned on. Because in those days you couldn't turn them on yourself as you can nowadays in some of them. If it was a red light, it was one of 2 things. Either just a beacon that wasn't necessarily on an airfield, or if it was on an airfield, they did not have night landing capabilities. On the back side, the white, or the front side rather, the white, if it was a double flash of white, that was a military installation. They also had another one that we never worked with and was seldom used, and that was a yellow backside, and that was for seaplanes. Even that was used very seldom. Now you could go from A to B following this airways, which was nothing more than a lighted highway, so to speak, from, let's say, from San Francisco to Salt Lake City or whatever it was. And you just followed these at a 25-mile interval. And that was all neat, except it had 2 very strong weaknesses. Number one, it was possible to have 2 different airways, and you get out a little bit out there, and you have the same identifier code from 2 of these, and if your compass was wrong, you could be in the wrong one. Ask the man who owned one, because it happened to me. I know it could do that. The other weakness, of course, was the fact that this was VFR. visual flight rules. If there were clouds around, the thing was worthless. They came up with the radio range. And I'm going to go through this fast because I can be here for a week and you probably won't understand it, because we did it and didn't understand it. But they sent out low frequency things with again, the Morse code identifiers, but this time everything is oral. None of it's visual. You're listening to it on the radio. And each quadrant is an A or an N, did-a or dot-it. And as you merged into the center part, they would gradually become a solid tone. And in that solid tone, which was roughly 3 degrees wide, was what they called the beam. And way back in those days, that was a pet phrase. Well, now you're on the beam. And that's where it came from. And it was good, it was better than nothing, let's put it that way. Again, had some terrible weaknesses, one of which is in mountainous terrain, and most overseas theaters, if you had that at all, and you usually didn't, the beams could bend all over the place, as much as 45 degrees off. And it could lead you, and it would usually lead you right into a mountainside, because that's what bent it, was the magnetic disturbance. Over here is a picture of how you would intercept one of those beams and bring it on down. And it kind of gives you an idea of what you're listening to this, you're not seeing it at all. Then this one shows you how you would bracket that beam once you approached it. Because you could never just turn right onto it and hit it. It just didn't happen. Nobody was that lucky or that good, either one. And then you went on in, and then you flew procedures to let down, if that's what you were going to do. Now, if you look at those things, it doesn't take you very long to come to two problems. First of all, if I'm getting an N, which quadrant am I in? And the second one is, which way am I going in that quadrant? So you have what you call range orientation, which is this one right here. And when you get down to doing this thing, you're in real trouble, because it takes a lot of fuel before you, if you really don't know where you are, it takes a lot of fuel to get through this orientation procedure. Now, we used to have to do that. Fortunately, I didn't have to do it but one time real, and I had enough fuel then, so it was okay. But how did we learn it? You know, we could be up there from then until now in airplanes, putting all those hours on them trying to do that. So they came up with this beauty right here, which is called a link trainer. And a link trainer, and we have one out in the B-17 hangar, as you probably know, out by Rocky's place there. And it does work, but it doesn't work completely. Works well, but not completely. The way this worked, you got in this little box and pull the lid down, and it was designed to do primarily procedure training, instrument procedure training, including the radio work and everything that went with it. And it was different from an airplane, because if you wanted to turn, you could just boot the rudder and it'd scoot around and that sort of thing. But we tried not to do that, because after all, it was a method of learning, and someday it might save us. And I don't think there are very many people alive who wouldn't say that it did. But there on the table outside this thing, they had a huge table with a map of or a chart of this area that you're flying on, and it had what they call a crab, which was a stylus that would move around and follow the moves that you were dictating by flying this airplane, if you want to call it that. So that when you got out of that box, you could climb down and you could see exactly what you had done. Good, bad, or in between. Great trainers. They weren't very good as far as a simulator is concerned, as far as learning to fly the airplane. No, but that was not their intent. Their intent was to teach those of us who didn't know how to do this to fly instruments properly and to get home safely. And for that, they were very, very good. We had some other problems. First of all, the one thing that I put aside that I'm going to come back to now is to figure out how to get into these. Now, how to get to the navigation point to start with. We said that almost everything originates, this stuff incidentally that I've been talking about with radio work, was mostly in the US. Once we went overseas, almost everything was dead reckoning, because the enemy was not going to give you a nice beam to fly or any of the rest of this stuff. You had to find them. So we had to compute that. This is an E6B computer, and this is what we did it all on. A handheld computer. It had two sides. This side you're looking at is the one that you computed your original stuff on. Everything that you were going to work into the final phase. And if you look at it closely, you can see where you have a little thing where you can adjust for temperature, for the altitude you're flying at. There's only one thing that's not included in here, and that's the winds. And from that, you can compute your true airspeed for the altitude you're going to fly at, everything except for one thing. That's what it was actually going to traverse over the ground or the water. You flipped it over to the other side, and it had a tube that went down through that plastic thing, and you entered in that all of the information you'd computed on the face of it, and then you put in there the winds, and you turn that little bugger to the right spot, and then it would tell you what your ground speed is going to be and what heading on the compass you had to fly to get there, because it's computing in the wind drift, the wind factor. And one of the things that a lot of us learned early in the game, this is one of the many reasons we like to fly as low as we could. The closer you were, particularly to the water, more so than the land, but the land too, the lower you were, the less effect you had from winds. It was usually much quieter. So therefore it was much more likely that that was going to be reasonably accurate wind forecast. And it was amazing, incidentally, to figure these things out. And you put them on paper, and you got them maybe on a little knee pad, or stick them up on the instrument panel, or any place wherever you could clip them, put them in your pocket and pull them out, and check them periodically. It was amazing how accurate they would turn out. The big wonder of all of this is not how many airplanes didn't make it over and back, but rather how many did with this crude form of navigation. Because you'd get out over the water and you would fly for what seemed like an eternity and never see anything but water and or clouds. And that's it. Nothing to go by. The biggest problem that we had was not maybe necessarily getting back to the island. It was getting back down on the runway once we got there. The weather was the one thing we could always count on when we left, is the weather was going to be rotten when we got back. We knew that. That was a foregone conclusion. And early in the days, you ran on sheer dumb luck and stupidity. The type of skill that only an immortal 19 and 20-year-old can provide. And the fact that we didn't really lose all that many is a true wonder. Because some of those landings were made under some of the hairiest conditions I could imagine. They terrify me now when I think back on them. Well, right at the very tail end of the war, we finally got the blessing. It was called GCA, Ground Control Approach. And to just show you what this is like, it's a radar with two basic operators, usually used four, but two guys were doing the operating, the other two were various assistants to them, because in those days everything was manual, nothing was automatic. And one of them would take you around and set you up onto the final approach, and the other one brought your final approach down. And his assistant was helping him with your elevation. He was running the azimuth, and his assistant was running the elevation. and they would tell you what headings and whether you were on the glide path and this sort of thing as we'd come in. Now, we had very little, we'd heard about these things, and one day we were up there and I leading a flight of 4, and we came back over the island, and it was, they said, closed, and we had no place to go. And we didn't even have an alternate island to get into because they were all down too. And the tower operator called me and he said, Red Leader, we got a GCA unit down here. They just finished setting up this morning. They say they think they can get you down if you want to try it. And I said, well, I have one question. First, what the heck is a GCA unit? And he said, it's a ground-controlled approach. It's radar. Aha. I've been in night fighters. I knew radar. I said, he can probably do a better job of it than I can. And I decided to go number 4 first, and I would go last. And I gave all of my guys in my flight instructions, I said, now, if you don't like it, don't land. Go on around. Don't take a chance on flying into a warehouse, because we don't know what they're going to do. So, to make a long story short, number 4 went in, and he landed. And he called back and he said, hey, it wasn't so bad. I had about 50 feet. Ah, okay, no sweat. Number 3, is, by this time, is just getting ready to turn final. And number 2 has left me, and I'm still up there orbiting overhead. And incidentally, I have to say that was probably, that 4 or 5 minutes up there was probably the loneliest 4 or 5 minutes that I ever spent in my entire life. Because here I was out of the cold blue Bering Sea all by myself, had no idea even where I was. So number 3 landed, and he said, well, it's pretty low, but I got down all right. Number 2 got down, and so by this time I'm on the let down, the equivalent of the downwind leg, and he's bringing me around there because they had us pretty well strung out. And it's getting worse and worse and worse as it progresses, and he tells us that we need to, and he told me, he said, I really need to get you down on the first pass. And I said, well, you know, if it's left up to me, that's sure agreeable to me. I don't have any reason to want to fly any longer. And so I came down the final approach. I get the gear and the flaps down, and I'm slowed down. And by this time, we were pretty experienced instrument pilots. So we went on down there, and I noticed the altimeter was winding down there. The island, the runway is only 40 feet above sea level. And it's down near that right now. And all of a sudden he says, he calls me, he says, Red Leader, you're over the end of the runway, chop your throttles and pray. And that did a great deal for my confidence right there. So I did, and I pulled back the stick. I felt it start falling out from underneath me, and I gave a little blast of the power because I didn't know what it was going to do. And just as I hit the throttles, I heard this "urch" from both gear, and to this day, I don't know what part of the runway I landed on. I'll never know. But he got us down. Then we found out afterwards, and this is the picture you see here, is what the GCA trailer looked like in those days and for many years afterwards. 4 people plus maybe a technician sitting inside that trailer with that spinner going round and round, round. And afterwards, we couldn't get to them, the weather was so bad, but we got to them by phone, found out they hadn't yet been certified. And I said, what do we do to get you certified? I'll sign that paper for whatever it is. And we did. And needless to say, they didn't buy any of the beer that night. They didn't have to pay for a thing. Though there is no way to tell how many of our P-38s in particular were saved by those people right there. And we lost one B-24 in that manner later on, and we lost it for one reason only, and that's the GCR radar was out. It was inoperative, and they hadn't been able to get it repaired in time. It was still a brand new unit. That gives you a little idea of what it was like to get from A to B back in those days when, as I've said so many times, the best of times and the worst of times all in one. Thank you.